What's going on, dudes? It's your boy, Andy the Nomad, and I got a really special video for you guys. So, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, Gen X, boomers. How did we get here? How did we get to hookup culture? I always wonder because growing up, I was one of the kids who didn't get the punani, if you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's right. I was one of the strugglers. While all my friends were getting the pum pum, I was left wondering, like, yeah, how do I make this happen? Right, that was me. That was your boy Andy. So the title of this video is Gen X to blame for hookup culture? I mean, nowadays, people are getting tired of hookup culture. People want more meaningful relationships. About 60% of, I think it's just 60% of men have stopped dating in America, in North America altogether. I think Gen Z, they don't really they don't really get punani that much, or at all. I think like 40% of them, 50% of them, a good chunk of them don't get the puniti. Let's just say. Right. So who is to blame for hookup culture? Because it seemed to have made relationships worse. It just seems to have made people more shallow. It makes the birth rate go down as people don't want to have kids. They just want to do the pum pum all day and then I don't know, just leave after they're done and like not care about the person who they slept with. And then they wonder why they have all these emotional issues. But anyways, getting ahead of myself. So I've been doing some research as to who is to blame for hookup culture. How did this start? How did we get here? And a little bit of history. Let's go back to the hippie era. So the hippie era was in the 1960s. The free love era. And it's kind of a shame because the hippie era ended pretty darn quick. It ended pretty darn quick. Like it didn't last very long. It was kind of like disco. Disco didn't last long either. The hippie era was very interesting, but very strange the way it ended. Like all of a sudden, just poof, gone, right? But also, what happened in the 1960s is the birth control pill was approved by the FDA. In the 1960s, the birth control pill was approved by the FDA. Now, of course, not everybody's gonna use it right off the bat, And I don't understand why girls use the birth control, because then it has like a whole bunch of like health issues and then like emotional issues. And then I think that's one of the reasons why girls go for like, really weird guys, because the pill makes them feel all weird. But anyways, I got off topic. Back to what we were saying. Birth control pill, 1960s. Now, at what time did Gen X, what is the time period exactly for Gen X? So Gen X, they were born from 1965 all the way to 1980s, right? Millennials are born from 1989 all the way to like the late 90s, I think. Yeah, late 90s. So let's do some math here. Gen X, most of them were born in 1965. So by the time the 70s came, or like the late 70s, they were about like 14, 15 years old. And by the time the 80s came, they were in their late teens, early 20s. Late teens, early 20s. Keep that in mind. So that means in the late teens, early 20s, they were rocking it out. Oh, by the way, the 1980s was also the time of hair metal and the rise of hip hop. We all know how much these rock stars got laid. Bands like Motly Crue, Whitesnake, and all these hair metal bands. It was an amazing time. You ever heard the term, get laid like a rock star? What is it? Like drugs, alcohol, and rock and roll? Yeah, drugs, alcohol, and rock and roll. Yeah, there you go. One hell of a time. Girls, puniti, alcohol, rock and roll, and AIDS breaking out from California. Let's not even go there. Now, I personally believe that hookup culture took off during the late 1970s and 1980s, right? The divorce rate started to increase in the 1980s as people became more promiscuous. Again, The 1980s had the best freaking music. I listened to a lot of 1980s music, 1980s rock bands, city pop, which came from Japan. The 1980s were an amazing time, and I'm telling you, those rock stars, they laid, man. They score big. And around that time, that's when teenagers were like, hey, when you gonna lose your virginity, So the divorce rate started to increase in 1980s as people became more promiscuous. So where does Gen X come into place? Well, they are the ones who started it. Gen X started it, remember? In the 1980s, 1970s. And of course, more and more chicks were using the birth control pill. And the birth control pill helped them, become more sexually liberated. And did you know that the birth control pill actually affects a woman's, choices in choosing a mate? That's a video for another. That's a topic for another video. But yeah, Gen X started it, and then they passed on that amazing knowledge to the next generation. The divorce rate continued to increase in the 1990s, and then in the early 2000s, teenage pregnancies became a thing. Remember that? I remember when I was in high school. I knew like 10 girls from my class in high school became pregnant at the age of 17, 18. It was crazy. So the effects of Gen X party era in the 1980s really influenced generations later on. A good example of this will be Johnny Lawrence from Cobra Kai.
Quiet! 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 Oh, you quiet!
Oh, I'm sorry. I think what I meant to say is quiet!
Johnny Lawrence from Cobra Kai. And then let's not forget the rap music the rise and shine of rap music, especially in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, mid 2000s, that's when rap music really became just more about, less about telling a story, more about, like big booties, getting laid and all that shit, right? You guys get the point. Rap music has changed. I think rap music now has become even more promiscuous than before. Because rock and roll, for example, rock and heavy metal, they sing about girls and shit, like Motly Crue singing about, hot chicks. But, like, their lyrics were not exactly sexualized. They most of their songs were love songs, and then, behind the stage, they were, like, smashing chicks left and right. So, again, it all goes back to the 1980s. It all goes back to the 1980s. Sex, alcohol, and rock and roll. I always get those wrong. And, so I think Gen X was a huge part of this. They have a lot to do with hookup culture. They're the ones that made it popular. They're the ones that kind of like, made it spread throughout the entire globe. Because before that, let's say in the 1950s, we had the nuclear family, right? Nuclear family, you get married, have kids, buy a house, picket fence, 2 kids, a dog, all that shit. In the 1960s, that's when, you get the birth control, all that shit, 1970s. And after the birth control pill, man, it started going crazy. And in the 1980s, just put that shit on steroids and, just amplified it. Right? And here we are. So I know that I'm going to have a lot of Gen Xers in the comment section, yelling at me, talking crap to me, like, oh, what do you mean it's our fault? Well, again, this is just my analysis on this. I'm just one person. If you have more details as to, how you think hookup culture came to be, if you have like, a better, just an overall, like share your story, share your analysis as to how hookup culture came to be. Like, how did we get here? Because if it's not because of the Gen Xers that got us here, then how did it start? Some people say that it started in the 1920s. Well, I mean, I doubt it. I doubt it because before the 1980s, like, dare I say, only like people with money did hookups, and then everybody else would have to like get into an actual relationship or get married to actually do the thing, right? And then, of course, before the 1980s, of course, there were kids, there were teenagers, people that just, did the thing without getting married. That's always been a thing. But I'm talking about like the acceptance, because it was never, it was usually like that people people would, you know, get married first and then do the thing, right? But in the 1980s, like when hookup culture basically gave an approval, it made it cool, right? It made hooking up cool. That's what the 1980s did. That's what the 1980s did. It made hookup culture cool. It made it acceptable, and for kids to go out and pursue that. And now here we are. So, whatever your thoughts are, comment below. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell for future notifications. Guys, it's your boy, Andy the Nomad. See you in the next video. Godspeed, baby.